The Weight of the Mark. Cold open, Fort Davidson, Texas, Friday night, 11:47 p.m. The emergency lights along the baseboards cast everything in amber, the color of old photographs, and rooms where things have gone wrong. 200 soldiers stood without speaking. Some of them still held their phones. Most of them were staring at a single point in the room drawn there by something that had no clean name, yet something that was still in the process of becoming what it would be remembered as. In the center of all that stillness, Colonel Warren Aldred raised his right hand. The salute was slow, not ceremonial slow, not the performance of respect for an audience. The slow of a man making absolutely certain that every element of the motion was correct, as though correctness was the only adequate response to what he was looking at. 34 years of uniform, 3 conflicts, 2 Purple Hearts, 1 nomination for Brigadier General he turned down without ever fully explaining why. In all of that, he had saluted presidents, 4-star generals, Medal of Honor recipients, and the flag-draped coffins of men he had personally sent into the field. He knew every weight a salute could carry. The people near him would spend the following weeks struggling to describe what was different about this one. To understand it, you have to go back 3 hours. You have to start with a woman that nobody in that room saw correctly. Part 1, the trap is set. Fort Davidson sits 40 miles south of Abilene in the flat, sun-beaten stretch of West Texas, where the land offers little in the way of comfort and even less in the way of concealment. The base has been there since 1942, originally a training installation, then a logistics hub, then something harder to define, one of those places that outlived its original purpose and found a new one through sheer institutional inertia, the kind mistaken for wisdom only by people who have never examined the difference. By 2019, it housed roughly 1,800 active duty personnel across 3 brigades, a medical unit, a signals detachment, and one of the most quietly corrosive command cultures in the Western United States. That last part appeared in no official report, but it lived in the air every morning during formation. It lived in the way junior enlisted soldiers learned to make themselves small in certain quarters, in the particular silence that followed certain names when said in certain rooms, in the accumulated weight of 100 small surrenders that individually looked like discipline and collectively looked like damage. On Friday evenings, the main canteen filled up the way it always did, loud, crowded a week's tension looking for somewhere to go. The fluorescent lights hummed at their standard frequency. The smell of institutional coffee and something fried mixed in the air in a combination that never fully became pleasant and never fully became unbearable. Near the far wall, 4 soldiers had pushed 2 tables together and were conducting a serious disagreement about college football that had apparently been ongoing since Thursday. This was Fort Davidson on a normal Friday. It would not stay normal. The man who changed the atmosphere of a room by entering it arrived at 8:52 p.m. Sergeant First Class Briggs Harmon did not announce himself. He never had to. At 6 feet 4 inches and north of 230 pounds, with a jaw that looked quarried rather than grown, he occupied space the way heavy weather does. You felt the pressure change before you saw him. He wore his uniform with the precision of someone for whom appearance was the one variable in life he had decided to control absolutely. Every crease exactly placed, every badge in its correct position. The external order of a man whose internal order had been disrupted at an age too early to recover from cleanly. The soldiers near the entrance redistributed themselves without being asked. Not dramatically, a subtle widening of gaps, a slight redirection of bodies. The involuntary adjustment of people in the presence of something they have learned to read as a weather system rather than a human being. Lieutenant Delia Voss was already seated near the serving counter, dark hair pulled back with severe precision, watching the room with the patient attention of someone who has learned that information is a resource and rooms are where it accumulates. She saw Briggs and offered the particular acknowledgement that existed between them, not warm, not cold, the confirmation between 2 people who have reached the same conclusions about how things work and find a certain efficiency in the agreement. Corporal Fletcher Quaid sat 2 tables away, large arms resting on the tabletop, watching the room with the ease of a man who has never examined his own comfort closely enough to find what it is built on. It was 8:54 p.m. when the east door opened and the evening shifted. She came in from the parking lot side. She was small, 5 feet 4 at most, slight build, a physical presence that crowds absorb without registering. Her hair was blonde and pulled back imperfectly, loose strands catching the fluorescent light. Her eyes were the washed-out blue of early morning sky before color arrives. She wore military pants and a gray-fitted shirt underneath a uniform jacket at least 2 sizes too large, the sleeves extending past her wrists, the shoulders sitting wrong. She picked up a tray at the serving counter and looked at the room the way a person looks at a map they are not certain how to read. To everyone in that canteen, she looked lost. She looked, as Briggs Harmon would say 30 seconds later, in a voice designed to carry across the full length of the room like someone wearing their father's clothes to a costume party. What none of them could see, what not a single person in that canteen understood yet, was what her eyes were actually doing. While her body performed uncertainty, with the discipline of someone who has rehearsed it until it is indistinguishable from the real thing, her eyes moved in controlled, systematic sweeps. East entrance, west exit, loading dock door on the north wall propped slightly open. 6 structural columns, 11 ceiling-mounted cameras, 3 of which showed the lag signature of outdated firmware. 2 blind spots near the supply corridor. 1 man in a corner booth who had been there long enough that the condensation ring beneath his coffee cup had dried and reformed, reading a newspaper with the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided precisely how they wanted to appear to the room around them. She filed all of it in the 3 seconds it took to pick up a napkin. Then she looked at the floor, and the performance resumed. In the corner booth near the emergency exit, a man named Slade Norris lowered his newspaper 2 inches. He was not remarkable looking, which was entirely the point. Medium height, medium build, a face that security cameras capture, and analysts skip past. He had been at Fort Davidson for 91 days undercover as a signals intelligence contractor, a role that provided access to the communication infrastructure, and a plausible reason to be almost anywhere on the installation at almost any time. For the organization known inside certain classified briefings as Shadow Protocol, Fort Davidson represented 18 months of groundwork, 11 recruited sources, and a communication intercept operation that had been running without a flag for 4 months. Slade had run operations on 4 continents. He was not a man who startled easily. But something about the woman with the oversized jacket and the lost expression made his hand tighten almost imperceptibly on the edge of his newspaper. He had seen footage of her operating in 3 other installations. He had read files that his handlers had marked with the careful understatement reserved for things that genuinely worried them. The woman those files referred to, in the rare moments they referred to her at all, as Ghost Dragon. He activated the recording device in his jacket with a motion invisible from 2 feet away. And then he waited, because men who survive in his profession understand that patience is not a virtue. It is a weapon. 3 tables from the serving counter, Private First Class Colt Ashby was writing a letter. This was not unusual. He wrote one every week on paper with a pen because his grandfather's hands had not worked properly since 1953. The tremor that had stayed with them after the chosen reservoir made typing on any keyboard more trouble than it was worth. His grandfather did not use a smartphone, did not use email, did not trust any technology developed after the Eisenhower administration. What he trusted was the mail and handwritten words, and the knowledge that somewhere north of Abilene, his grandson was thinking of him enough to put something down on paper. His grandfather had been 19 years old at Chosin. He did not talk about it often. When he did, it came in the voice of a man who has learned that certain things in life are non-negotiable, and that the most important of them have nothing to do with comfort or safety or the good opinion of people you will forget in 5 years. He had said once, with the compression of a man who has distilled decades into a single line, when you go quiet in front of something wrong, you are not staying neutral. You are casting a vote for the side that is already winning. Colt was 23 words into the letter when Briggs Harmon spoke. Military uniforms aren't Halloween costumes. The voice carried the full length of the canteen without apparent effort. Briggs had not moved from his position, but his voice had it cross the room with the practiced ease of a man who understood that volume claims territory before the body does. 200 heads turned. The woman with the oversized jacket stood at the serving counter with a paper napkin in her hands. Her shoulders curved slightly inward. Her gaze dropped to the floor. Briggs took 3 steps forward, deliberate, each one a statement. Seriously, who authorized this? This is a federal military installation. He gestured to the room in the expansive way of a man inviting an audience to participate in a verdict he has already reached. What exactly is the plan here? The laughter started near the back and moved forward. Phones materialized. The canteen reorganized itself as audiences do when something they are watching becomes something worth filming. Delia Voss rose from her seat and crossed the floor with the fluid movement of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment. She stopped beside Briggs, close enough to signal alignment, far enough to maintain the appearance of independent judgment. "Oh, honey." Her voice dropped into the register of theatrical concern, the mask that lands harder than contempt because it wears the face of caring. "The USO show is on Wednesday nights." More laughter, louder. The woman said nothing. She stood with her napkin and her downcast eyes and absorbed it all, with a stillness that, if anyone had been paying close attention, might have read less like distress and more like patience. Not the patience of someone enduring something. the patience of someone waiting for something. Colt Ashby put down his pen. Fletcher Quaid decided to contribute. This was how it always worked with Fletcher, not cruelty by design, but the participation of a man who mistakes momentum for permission. He stood with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never found the bottom of his own certainty and issued a challenge in the tone of someone setting a test they are sure will be failed. Basic drill commands, he said. You're wearing our uniform. Let's see if you know what to do in it. What happened next made approximately 40 people in the canteen begin, without realizing it, to revise their assessment of the evening. The woman came to attention. Not approximately, not in the general direction of attention. She arrived at a position so precisely correct in its angles and its stillness that two drill sergeants near the beverage station exchanged a look neither of them would fully explain later. Fletcher called commands. About face, present arms, parade rest. She executed each one at the timing of someone for whom these movements had long since stopped requiring thought, not memorized, absorbed, which is a different thing entirely, and audible to anyone who has spent enough time around soldiers to hear the difference. The laughter thinned. Briggs stepped forward and reclaimed the floor before the silence could say what it was starting to say. YouTube, he announced. Anyone can memorize a few moves. He unholstered his sidearm, cleared the chamber with theatrical flair, and extended the empty weapon toward her. Field strip and reassemble. 30 seconds. Let's see something real. 40 phones stayed raised. What happened next would appear in their footage for approximately 6 seconds before most of them stopped understanding what they were watching. She took the weapon. She checked the chamber, not because she needed to confirm what Briggs had already shown her, but because muscle memory reaching for a safety check does not ask for permission first. The motion was automatic, brief, and unmistakably professional in a way that two people in the canteen caught and filed in places they could not yet explain. Then her hands moved. The pistol came apart in a sequence that had nothing to do with instruction and everything to do with repetition, so deep it had become reflex. Spring, barrel, slide, frame. Each component placed on the counter in perfect order. The movements unhurried because someone operating at that level of competence does not need to hurry. Speed is the byproduct. Efficiency is the engine. 14 seconds for full disassembly. One breath of pause. Then the reassembly, which was faster because putting something together correctly requires only certainty, while taking it apart requires confirmation at each stage. Components flowed together with the quiet mechanical language of metal, finding its proper relationship with metal. Click, snap, slide. 12 seconds, 26 total. She placed the reassembled weapon beside Briggs' hand and stepped back. The canteen achieved a silence that needed time to be understood. Briggs looked at his stopwatch, at the weapon, at the woman. The expression that had occupied his face for the previous 4 minutes was still technically present, but something underneath it had evacuated the way a fire looks the same for a moment after the fuel is gone. Beginner's luck, he said. The volume was unchanged, but the thing beneath the volume had gone somewhere, and the people closest to him heard its absence even without a word for what was missing. Fletcher had already moved to the arms locker. Let's try the M4, he said. The M4 carbine is not a complicated weapon by the standards of modern military equipment, but field stripping it cleanly under observation in under 20 seconds belongs to a specific population. Weapons instructors, special operations personnel, people who have spent enough time with the weapon that the disassembly has migrated from the conscious part of the brain to the part that operates without consultation. The current base record was 18 seconds. Briggs announced it like a verdict. The woman approached the table. Her hands reached for the weapon with movements that seemed to the people watching closely almost reluctant, as though she was deciding something rather than preparing for something. She picked it up, checked the chamber. Her eyes remained level, not fixed on the weapon, not fixed on anything in particular. The look of someone who has gone somewhere internal that the external world does not have access to. What followed lasted 16 seconds. Soldiers who were present would later describe it in contradictory terms. Some said machine, some said the opposite of machine, something so organic it looked less like procedure and more like a natural process, water moving around an obstacle. The truth lives between those descriptions and beyond both of them. It was absolute familiarity. The look of someone doing something they have done 10,000 times without ceremony, without performance, without the need for either. Upper receiver, lower receiver, bolt carrier group. Each component in the proper sequence, the disassembly complete in under 8 seconds. The reassembly in under 9. The final takedown pins engaged with a sound like a small, decisive door closing. 16 seconds total. A new base record by 2 seconds. She stepped back from the table, Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a soldier said quietly and without intending to be heard, "That is not possible." But it had happened in front of 200 witnesses and 40 recording devices, and the people holding those devices had stopped thinking about social media 5 seconds into the demonstration and had not started again. Warren Aldred, who had entered the canteen during the M4 demonstration without anyone noticing, stood near the far wall with the expression of a man in the process of revising something fundamental. In his corner booth, Slade Norris was no longer reading his newspaper. He had read the partial facial recognition match 3 times. Each time he arrived at the same conclusion his training told him was impossible and his instincts told him was true. He had spent 91 days telling himself the woman in those photographs was not going to appear in West Texas on a Friday night. He activated his encrypted phone and composed 4 words: "Target demonstrating advanced capabilities." The response came back in under 2 minutes. "Maintain surveillance. Do not engage until identity confirmed." He put the phone away and watched Briggs Harmon move toward the woman with the energy of someone who has decided the rules of the previous 5 minutes no longer apply. What Slade was watching, and what he had been watching for 91 days without fully understanding it, was not a mission going wrong. It was a trap closing around him 1 millimeter at a time with the patience of something designed specifically to be invisible until it was too late to matter. He did not know that yet. "Impressive trick," Briggs said. He was circling now, the movement of someone who needs motion to maintain authority when stillness has stopped working. But handling equipment is the easy part. Let's talk about what a real soldier actually knows. The questions came in rapid succession, designed to find the floor. Effective range of the M4 carbine. Standard combat medic load at a forward operating base. Authentication protocol for calling close air support in a danger close situation. Each question landed. Each answer came back. 550 meters, point target, 600 area target. Combat medic carries on IV fluids, trauma bandages, morphine auto-injectors, quick clot, hemostatic agents, a surgical airway kit, and chest seals for penetrating thoracic wounds. Danger close air support requires command authentication, precise grid coordinates for both target and friendly forces, and personnel accountability confirmation within the estimated blast radius before any ordnance release. Her voice had changed. Still quiet, but acquired a quality that had not been present before. Not louder, not harder, more certain in the way that deep water is more certain than shallow. The answers were not recited. They were retrieved. Anyone who has ever been questioned about something they truly know versus something they merely memorized will recognize the difference immediately. Delia Voss found herself reaching for a pen. Fletcher was checking his answers against a database. They were all correct. In several cases, they were more complete than the database. Colt Ashby had been standing still since the M4 demonstration. He was 19 years old and had been in the Army for 7 months, and in 6 of those months, he had learned without anyone formally teaching him that the correct response to most situations at Fort Davidson was silence. Not productive silence. The silence that passes as compliance and costs something each time it is used, the kind his grandfather had described in a letter Colt kept in the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked at the woman absorbing each question with quiet precision. He looked at the crowd filming her. He looked at Briggs still searching for something that would restore what the M4 demonstration had taken from him. He put his unfinished letter in his pocket. "Maybe," he said loud enough to be heard across the canteen, "we should leave her alone." The room went quiet in a different register. Briggs turned toward him with the deliberate slowness of something larger than a human being, deciding how to respond to something smaller. "What did you say, Private?" "I said maybe we should leave her alone, Sergeant." Colt's hands were not entirely steady. His voice was. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Delia's smile changed registers. No longer the smile of someone enjoying a conclusion, the smile of someone who has spotted a variable they intend to use. "The new kid has a crush," she said with the particular warmth of someone deploying warmth as a weapon. Briggs took one step toward Colt, not rushed. The movement of a man to whom proximity is a language. "Since you're so concerned, Private, you can stand here with her while we figure out who she is and why she's on this installation." Colt did not move. And the woman who had been standing with downcast eyes and curved shoulders and the practiced stillness of someone waiting for the right moment, because the right moment was the only moment that would mean anything, glanced up briefly in his direction. What Colt saw in her eyes lasted less than a second. Not gratitude, not fear. Something older than either the recognition of someone who has watched this exact scene in different rooms with different names and knows with absolute precision how it ends. She looked back at the floor. In his corner booth, Slade Norris wrote 2 words in the margin of his newspaper that he would later burn. Too late. Warren Aldred stepped forward from the far wall. At 61, he had the weathered precision of a man forged rather than built. 3 combat deployments, 2 wounds that healed clean, one that did not, 34 years of learning that the most dangerous situations almost always look the most manageable at the beginning. He read the room in 4 seconds. The crowd, the phones, the woman at the center. Briggs with the contained energy of something that has not yet decided what it is going to do. And underneath all of it, the pressure change that experienced commanders learn to recognize the way old sailors read weather, not from any single indicator, but from everything at once. What is the situation here? His voice required no amplification. 30 years of command had built it into something that finds the back wall of any room without effort. Briggs came to attention with the automatic reflex of military conditioning, the previous expression settling into something more appropriate for a superior officer's presence. Informal security review, sir. Checking authorization for personnel in uniform on the installation. Aldred's eyes moved to the woman. She produced documents from inside the jacket, with movements carefully visible, the motion of someone who wants the gesture to be fully seen. She extended them without eye contact. He took them and read. His expression moved through professional neutrality, then the slight furrow of confusion, then something quieter and more significant. The look of a man encountering something his clearance level was not designed to handle. These orders are unusual, he said slowly. The authorization codes are correct, but the assignment parameters are classified above my level. In his corner booth, Slade had gone completely still. His phone showed a new message, the preliminary facial recognition result back through a database that Shadow Protocol should not have been able to access, which meant someone had let them access it, which meant the information was either the most significant intelligence finding in the operation's history or the most carefully constructed piece of bait he had ever seen. He looked at the woman standing at the center of the canteen. She was looking at the floor. Her hands were perfectly still. And Slade Norris, who had survived 15 years in the most unforgiving corners of American intelligence, by trusting the feeling that arrives before the explanation, felt something settle in his chest, like a stone dropping through deep water. He had been here 91 days. Every day he had believed he was watching her. He was beginning to understand that the entire time she had been watching him. Part 2, the mask falls. The questions that followed were designed to find a floor. That is the purpose of that kind of interrogation, not to learn, but to locate the point at which the other person runs out. Briggs Harmon understood this with the intuitive fluency of someone who has practiced it for years without ever naming the practice. The specifics changed. The structure never did. You push until you find the bottom, and once you find the bottom, you own the room. What he had not accounted for was a room with no bottom. Fletcher Quaid fed questions from a tactical reference database. Briggs delivered them. The woman answered them. The distinction between doctrinal responses for a hasty ambush versus a deliberate ambush. Triage protocol for 3 casualties with a closing medevac window. Fire support coordination at the platoon level under degraded communications. Each answer came back correct in the specific way that field experience produces. Not recited, retrieve the information, living somewhere below the level of conscious recall. Briggs kept asking. Fletcher kept finding questions, and with each exchange, the room tilted incrementally in a direction that no one present had anticipated when the evening began. The combat medicine challenge was Delia Voss's contribution. She retrieved a standard military trauma kit from behind the serving counterpart of the base emergency preparedness distribution and set it on the nearest table with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about the staging. She selected a scenario from the Advanced Trauma Qualification Exam, the level given to candidates for combat medic certification, and delivered it with the measured authority of someone who believed this was the question that would finally locate the floor. A soldier takes fragmentation to the upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. He is conscious. Blood loss rate gives you approximately 3 minutes before he is unrecoverable. Standard trauma kit. 1 tourniquet, no additional personnel. Show me what you do. What happened next clarified 2 things simultaneously. The first was that Sloan Mercer had done this before. Not practiced it. Done it. Practiced motion retains the fingerprints of instruction, the slight hesitation at each decision point, the invisible ghost of a checklist being consulted. What her hands did when they moved to the training mannequin had none of that. They moved with the directness of someone whose body had solved this problem in real conditions and filed the solution below the level where thought is required. Direct pressure proximal to the wound. Tourniquet placed 2 inches above the injury site, tightened to the disappearance of the distal pulse. The sequence continued: shock positioning, airway assessment, evac-access preparation, each step at the tempo of genuine emergency rather than demonstration. The movements clean and economical, in the way that emergency medicine becomes after enough repetitions under enough actual pressure. 45 seconds from first contact to stabilize patient. She stepped back and called the time herself without checking a clock. The way people call time when their body has run this race enough times to keep its own count. The narrator part of this story, the voice that exists between the events themselves, would pause here the way it should for something worth pausing for. There is a generation of Americans who know that medicine, who watched it performed on men they knew on fields far from home in years when a helicopter medevac was the difference between a letter sent home and a body sent home. The trauma protocols running through Sloan Mercer's hands were the same protocols developed after Korea refined through Cold War proxy conflicts and proven again in the sand and heat of Desert Storm in 1991. Any man who had served in a medical capacity from the late 60s through the 90s would have recognized every step, not because it was textbook, but because it was real. Because hands that perform that sequence in genuine emergency develop a signature and urgency that does not entirely disappear even when the emergency is simulated. It lives in the muscle. It stays in the fingers. The soldiers in that canteen who were old enough to have seen that medicine up close were no longer filming. They were remembering. Delia Voss stared at the mannequin, then at Sloan, then back at the mannequin. The expression on her face was moving through several rooms simultaneously. Disbelief, confusion, and beneath both, something harder to name, the specific vertigo of a person whose internal architecture has been built around a conclusion that is no longer holding its weight. Aldred had not moved from his position near the wall. He was thinking about 1987. He did not often think about 1987 with this much clarity. Usually it came in fragments, arriving at inconvenient hours and departing before he could examine it directly. A name, the particular sound of a specific door closing, the weight of a decision not made at the moment it needed to be made. Her name was Corporal Frances Aldridge, 26 years old, one of 3 women in her unit and one of the best soldiers Aldred had served alongside in his first decade of active duty. She had been systematically dismantled by a sergeant whose methods differed from Briggs Harmon's in style, but not in substance. Aldred had known. He had filed it in the category that certain men of his generation used for things they were unwilling to confront at personal cost, the category that masquerades as professional neutrality and is something considerably less defensible. Frances Aldridge had requested a transfer 6 months later. He had approved it without a conversation. He had never learned what became of her. 32 years. The weight of a wrong thing does not distribute over time. It concentrates. He looked at the woman standing at the center of his canteen. He looked at the documents in his hand with their impossible authorization codes. He looked at Briggs Harmon, who was now pushing toward a tactical land navigation challenge with the focused determination of someone who has decided the outcome of this evening is a matter of personal necessity. Fletcher spread a topographical chart on the nearest table, the operational area map covered in grid references and elevation markers in the layered military symbology that takes training to read and additional training to use. He asked her to plot a concealed movement route from the installation to a forward checkpoint, avoiding known patrol schedules and observation post lines of sight. A staff college examination question. Sloan looked at the map for 15 seconds. Her eyes moved across it in systematic patterns, processing the elevation lines and grid references against some internal model of how terrain translates to movement. The look of genuine tactical thinking, which cannot be faked because it is not the look of someone processing information, but the look of someone already moving through the ground. She marked waypoints. Primary route follows the eastern ridgeline to maintain elevation advantage and avoid the observation post at the cited grid reference. Alternate route uses the creek bed for concealment, but adds 40 minutes and presents a secondary vulnerability at the second crossing. Emergency extraction coordinates at this point with a fallback rally position at this elevation, providing both cover and line of sight to the primary exfiltration corridor. The route was tactically sound in a way that Aldred, who had moved to look at it, recognized immediately. This was not recreational navigation or basic land movement. This was the movement planning of someone who had walked through hostile terrain with people depending on them to get it right, who understood the difference between a route that looks safe on paper and a route that is safe on the ground. "Where did you learn this?" he asked quietly. "Practice, sir." The word landed differently than it had the first time she said it. Everything she had demonstrated in the previous hour had restructured the word's weight. What kind of practice produces this? What kind of training creates competence that exceeds career soldiers? Briggs Harmon stared at the rote and told himself he saw a flaw. The argument was technical and not entirely wrong and not entirely right, and the 3 senior NCOs within earshot heard the difference and said nothing. It was at the precise moment when the room had tipped and not yet settled that Slade Norris rose from his corner booth. He moved along the canteen's periphery with the unremarkable deliberateness of someone doing something ordinary. He picked up a cup at the serving counter, poured coffee, stood beside Sloane with the casual proximity of strangers sharing a space. He did not look at her. What he said was quiet enough for only her to hear, delivered in the flat affect of coordinates rather than threat. "I know who you are, Mercer. Stand down right now. Walk out the east door and we end this quietly, or Blythe does not make it through the night." He expected some version of fear, not necessarily visible. He had run this kind of leverage operation before and understood that trained personnel often absorb a threat without showing it on their faces. But the body tells the truth at a slower rate than the face does. A change in breathing, a weight shift, the microtension of muscles responding to what the conscious mind is trying to contain. Sloane's hands, which had been steady through everything, developed the slightest tremor. The coffee cup moved almost imperceptibly. Her breathing changed in the specific pattern of a fear response beginning. Slade processed it, filed it in the correct column, began composing the extraction protocol in the operational part of his mind that runs logistics independently of everything else. He was stepping away from the counter when he heard her voice, barely present, directed at the middle distance the way people speak when they are uncertain whether they want to be heard. She said, "Tell your handler I said hello." Slade stopped. He did not turn around. He stood with his coffee cup and processed those words against everything he knew about this operation, about Shadow Protocol, about the 91 days he had spent inside Fort Davidson, building something he believed was invisible. He thought about the trembling hands, the near-dropped cup, the fear response that had arrived exactly on schedule and looked exactly as it was supposed to look. He thought about 16 seconds in a base record. He thought about the map exercise, about 45 seconds in a stabilized patient. He thought about the particular kind of patience required to perform uncertainty in a room full of people for 3 months without once allowing the performance to slip. He set his cup on the nearest surface and walked back to his corner booth without looking at her, and sat down and understood for the first time since arriving at Fort Davidson that there was a version of this evening in which he had never been the one doing the watching. The demand for a body search was Briggs Harmon's final move. He framed it in the language of security protocol, which gave it technical cover that was difficult to argue against directly unknown individual advanced capabilities, inconsistent with stated authorization, potential security threat to a federal installation. All of it defensible in form, all of it built for a purpose that had nothing to do with security, which is a thing that institutional language is often used to do, and which is among the most corrosive of the uses to which institutional language gets put. Delia Voss stepped forward with the eagerness of someone who had been waiting for the conversation to arrive at this particular door. Aldridge said clearly, and with command weight, "Sergeant, that is not necessary." Briggs acknowledged the objection with the form of military deference, while pressing past its substance the way someone holds a door open with correct courtesy while walking through it in the wrong direction. The framing held. The logic was technically sound, and Aldridge, who had carried the weight of 1987 for 32 years, and had spent the last hour watching the same architecture reconstruct itself in front of him, said the words that needed to be said, and found them landing in air that had stopped listening. The phones came up again. The crowd realigned. Colt Ashby took a step forward. His hands were not steady. His voice was, "Sir, this isn't right." Briggs turned with the slow deliberateness of something calculating distance. Colt did not move back. He was 19 years old with 7 months of service, and he understood with complete clarity what standing there was going to cost him. And he stood there anyway because his grandfather had put something in a letter about the 2 kinds of quiet, and Colt had been carrying that letter in his inside pocket for 3 years, and some things carried long enough become structural. Delia was already moving toward Sloane. Aldridge said, "Wait," and Sloane Mercer said in a voice quiet and clear and without a trace of performance, "It is all right, Colonel. If the sergeant believes a search is necessary for installation security, I will comply." Briggs processed those words as surrender, the final confirmation of what the evening had been building toward the moment when the pretense collapses and the correct order of things reasserts itself. Colt heard something different in those words, could not have named what, but the quality of her voice when she said them was not the quality of a voice that has run out of options. It was the voice of a person who has arrived at the place they were heading the entire time. Aldred heard it too. 3 decades of command had given him the ability to recognize the moment when waiting shifts into action, when a person stops enduring a situation and begins resolving it. He understood what it meant. He was 1 second too slow in understanding what was about to happen. Sloane Mercer removed the oversized jacket with the calm efficiency of completing a familiar task. She set it over the back of the nearest chair. The fitted gray shirt beneath confirmed what the jacket had suggested, A body built not for appearance, but for function, for endurance under load, for the sustained operation of a human system, under conditions that take apart most people who have not been designed for them. Several people in the crowd began in real time to revise the interpretation of the entire evening. Briggs said what came next to keep the frame from collapsing. Delia moved into position, and Sloane reached for the hem of her shirt. The canteen held every breath it had. She lifted it slowly. What appeared first was her lower back-defined musculature, belonging to someone for whom physical preparation is as fundamental as breathing. But it was what lay above that stopped the room. The tattoo began at the base of her spine and covered her entire back. Shoulder blade to shoulder blade, base of neck to lower spine, basomage. Two dragons, one the black of deep water, one the white gray of polished bone. Their bodies intertwined in perfect bilateral symmetry, each scale individually rendered, each claw sharp enough to seem capable of cutting through the skin rather than living on it. The flames surrounding them were executed with the precision of someone who understood that fire is not one thing, but many things happening simultaneously, individual tongues, each distinct, each positioned with the intention of someone making an argument rather than a decoration. It was extraordinary artistry. It was also something else. The something else was what registered on Warren Aldred's face. He had seen the dragon balance mark twice before in his career. Once in a classified briefing in 2003. Once on a photograph in a folder he had not been intended to see. He had been told by people whose information he trusted that there were 12 living operators authorized to carry it. He had never expected to encounter it in person. He had never expected to encounter it in West Texas. He straightened. His right hand came up. The salute was slow, not ceremonial, not the performance of respect for an audience. The slow of a man making certain that every element was correct, as though the correctness itself was the only adequate thing he had to offer the gesture that closed a 32-year distance in the space of a single raised arm. Lieutenant Sloane Mercer, he said, call sign Ghost Dragon, SEAL Team 6. The formal identification arrived in the canteen the way a large object arrives in still water, initial impact, then rings moving outward, touching everything. Briggs Harmon's face evacuated its color so completely and so quickly that it was clinical to observe. The expression that had occupied his face for the better part of an hour did not fade so much as abandon its position, leaving behind something that was not yet fear or shame or understanding, but the raw material of all three waiting to be organized. Delia Voss's phone hit the concrete floor. The crack of the screen was the only sound in the room for 2 full seconds. Fletcher Quaid took one step backward without deciding to. In the crowd, the recognition spread through people with enough context to understand what they had heard. Not everyone knew the dragon balance. Enough did. The name moved through the canteen in whispers that carried the weight of something encountered only in classified briefings and never in person. Ghost Dragon. Sloane lowered her shirt. She turned and faced the room. For the first time since entering through the east door with her oversized jacket and her careful performance of uncertainty, she looked directly at the people looking at her. The expression on her face was not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of a person who has won something. It was something older and quieter. The expression of a person who waited for the right moment because the right moment was the only one that would mean anything, and who understands that meaning and victory are different measurements. My orders were to assess base security protocols under operational cover, she said. Her voice carried to every corner without effort. Sergeant Harmon's conduct has provided extensive documentation. She did not look at Briggs when she said it. She did not need to. The lights went out, not flickering, not fading. All at once, the way power dies when interrupted at the source. The canteen dropped into darkness, broken only by the amber emergency lighting along the baseboards, the same amber that had opened this story before anyone knew what they were watching. 200 people produced the sounds of 200 people suddenly placed in darkness. Sloane's voice cut through before the noise could organize itself. Nobody move. Nobody speak. Do not activate any electronic device. The authority in those words was absolute in a way that had nothing to do with rank or volume. It was the authority of someone who understood what the darkness meant, why it had arrived at this exact moment, and what was coming next. In his corner booth, Slade Norris had already activated his extraction protocol. The 12-person Shadow Protocol Rapid Response Team staged at the installation's perimeter for the past 6 hours was now moving. 3 ingress vectors, overlapping fields of coverage, communications center, and command post as primary objectives. Elimination parameters active. The protocol was clean. It had worked in 4 previous operational environments. The team reached the first ingress point. They found it covered, not by base security, not by anything appearing in the Fort Davidson organizational chart, by operators who moved in complete silence and carried equipment not issued through any standard military supply channel, who had been in position since 6 hours before Sloan Mercer walked through the east door. The second ingress point was the same. The third, 12 professional operatives processed the information that they were not executing a controlled elimination. They were walking into something built around them with the patience and precision of a structure designed specifically for the shape of the thing it was built to catch. Inside the canteen, Sloan was already moving position, shifting without sound, her location impossible to fix from any fixed point in the room. When she spoke again, her voice came from somewhere different. Colt Ashby. Yes, ma'am. You are my communications relay. Authentication code is Tango 77 Echo. Tell base security Ghost Dragon is active and requesting immediate tactical support for a hostile extraction operation. Those words exactly. Colt repeated them exactly and moved toward the secure communication terminal with the purposefulness of a man who has been handed a task by someone whose competence has in the preceding 90 minutes been established beyond any remaining question. The tablet in Sloana's hand cast faint light in the darkness. Heat signatures at the perimeter, 12 of them encountering something they had not anticipated. Then the tablet chimed. The image that loaded showed a woman, young, athletic, with Sloane's coloring and the composed quality of someone trained to appear calm in all conditions. She was bound. She was not conscious. The timestamp was 47 minutes prior. The text below, 72 hours, come alone, any attempt at rescue, and she does not wake up. Sloane's hands had been steady through everything the evening had produced. They did not shake now either, but the tablet for the first time was held just slightly tighter than its weight required. The body telling the truth, the face was managing. Aldred, who had been reading Sloane for the past 90 minutes with 34 years of accumulated perception, saw it. He understood that every warrior carries something that the warrior in them cannot fully armor against. Not weakness, not failure. Something more fundamental than either the place where mission and person meet, where what you do and who you are cannot be kept in separate rooms. Sloane lowered the tablet. We worked the problem, she said. In the amber darkness of Fort Davidson, with Shadow Protocol's operatives encountering a perimeter they had not designed and her sister's photograph burning on a secure screen, and 200 soldiers waiting in the emergency lighting, the work began. Part 3, The Real Hunter. The darkness in the canteen was not quiet. It held the sound of 200 people breathing carefully, the ventilation system running its indifferent course and at varying distances from the building, the sounds of a perimeter encountering something it had not been designed for. Sloane worked the tablet with the economy of someone for whom this interface is as natural as a pen. Fingers moving across the display while she spoke in a voice calibrated to carry to the people it needed to reach and stop at the people it did not. Heat signatures on the screen. 12 points of light at the installation's edges. Their movement patterns shifting from the coordinated confidence of a team executing a clean extraction into something more lateral and cautious. The signature of professionals who have recognized that the ground has changed without yet understanding how completely. They were staged before the reveal, she said to Aldred, who had moved close enough to read the screen. The extraction protocol was written before tonight. This was a contingency already in place. He processed this. They knew the assessment was operational. They knew someone was here running an assessment. They did not know who, or they would not have sent 12 people to a location where the target had already established a defensive perimeter. She paused. They knew enough to be dangerous, not enough to be right. Briggs Harmon had not moved from the center of the floor. He stood in the amber light with his hands at his sides, still in the specific way of a man who has been moving at speed for a very long time and has run into something that stops him, not violently but completely, the way a wall stops a person differently than a door does. He was looking at Sloane, not the way he had been looking at her an hour ago, when looking was an act of territorial assessment. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that has rearranged the room without touching a single piece of furniture. They are using the same leverage on you, he said, that I used on everyone else in this building for 3 years. His voice was different. Same volume. The thing beneath the volume had changed. Compressed the way things compress when the air has been taken out of them. They found what matters to you, packaged it as a threat, made the choice look like a choice between compliance and loss when both options actually serve them. If you go, they get you. If you refuse, you spend your capacity on the grief of refusing instead of on the problem. He stopped. That is the mechanism. I know what it looks like from both ends. The canteen was listening with the quality of attention that rooms develop when something true is being said in them. Delia Voss, standing near the far wall, heard it and felt something move through her that took a moment to identify. She had spent 6 years constructing a version of herself inside an institution that had communicated her partial welcome in 100 indirect ways, and the version she had built had required certain tools she had justified as survival. She was now in the amber light of an emergency with a SEAL Team 6 operator 10 feet away, beginning to examine those tools from the outside rather than the inside. The tool she had used the most reliably was the one Briggs had just described. Sloan studied him for 3 seconds, the study of someone reading, quickly but thoroughly, looking for what lies beneath the surface presentation. "Your father," she said, 1974. He went still in a different way than before. "The discharge was dishonorable. You were 5 years old." Her voice stayed level without softness, not because she was being cruel, but because she understood he had spent 40 years with the softened version, and it had not helped him. "You spent the next 35 years becoming the thing he was accused of not being: disciplined, decorated, unimpeachable." She paused. "And somewhere in that effort, you stopped being able to tell the difference between building yourself up and pushing other people down to create the elevation." He said nothing. "You did not invent that mechanism," she said, "but you chose to use it. Both of those things are true, and the second one does not disappear because of the first." "I know. Fort Bragg will ask you to look at both. Do not let them settle for only the second one. The first one matters too, and the people who work with you afterward will be better served by a man who understands his own formation than by a man who has only been corrected." He nodded once, not the nod of agreement reached easily, but the nod of agreement reached at cost, which is the only kind that holds. She moved away from him, back toward the center of the floor, and distributed the remaining work. "Fletcher." Corporal Fletcher Quaid came to attention. "The kitchen service corridor connects to the maintenance bay. The maintenance bay has a reinforced exterior door not on the primary access map." She had memorized the installation's infrastructure in her first 2 weeks. Take everything from the serving counter with weight and mobility fire suppression, canisters, heavy equipment, and establish a secondary barrier at the corridor junction. You are not building a wall, you are building a decision point, something that costs them time. Fletcher moved with a purposefulness that had not been present in his earlier movements, the focus of a man who has been waiting without knowing it for something concrete to do. "Delia, the communication terminal at the east wall runs on a separate circuit, still active. Access the base-wide alert system and initiate Emergency Security Protocol 7. Use Colonel Aldred's command authorization." Aldred provided his code without hesitation. Delia moved to the terminal. "Colt." She looked at him last. He was holding the field radio from the emergency kit, waiting with the steady patience of someone who has been given a task and intends to complete it. "The security detail on the east perimeter. There should be a duty officer running the overnight watch rotation. Not 20 years old. A career NCO. Find that frequency." Colt was already turning the dial. The voice that answered was exactly what she had said it would be. Not young. Not the voice of someone on their first duty rotation still learning to distinguish protocol from situation. It was the voice of a man who had been answering this kind of call long enough that his calm was built, rather than performed, his nervous system having been through enough genuine emergencies that a new one arrives in a space already cleared for it. Sergeant Major Carl Pruitt, 58 years old, 31 years active duty, 4 years retired civilian contractor position running the overnight security watch because, as he had explained to his wife, with the plain logic that had characterized him for 4 decades, he did not know what else to do with himself after dark. He had served in Desert Storm. He had served in Bosnia. He had been in places that remain classified and conditions that do not improve with description. When Colt gave the authentication code, Carl Pruitt did not ask for it, repeated. He ran it against his memory of the rotational briefing codes and said in the flat declarative tone of a man who has already decided what comes next, "Copy that, son. Tell me what you need." The specificity of those 4 words, not "stand by for verification," not "I will need to confirm this," but "tell me what you need," hit Colt somewhere below the sternum in a way he did not have the language for yet. He was 19 years old and standing in a blacked-out canteen on a base, being encircled by people intending to kill everyone in the room, and the voice on the other end of the radio sounded like his grandfather. He told Carl Pruitt what they needed. Carl Pruitt said, "Understood," and the channel went quiet. And 60 seconds later, the sounds from the northern perimeter changed in a way that Sloan, tracking the heat signatures on her tablet, registered with the brief, contained nod of someone checking a line on an internal list. Briggs had positioned himself at the junction point without being asked. Not because Sloan had directed him there, because he had looked at the tactical layout, identified the position of greatest vulnerability for forced entry from the east corridor, and moved to it with the spatial reasoning of a man who had spent years learning violence and had finally found a context in which that knowledge served something other than itself. He stood in the amber light with his arms loose at his sides, and his face held the expression of a man who has come to the end of a long argument with himself and arrived unexpectedly at something resembling peace on the other side. The east door opened at 12 minutes past lights out, not with force, with the controlled quiet of a lock released from the inside by someone given the code. Two Dragon Balance operators entered first, sweeping the space with the fluid coordination of people who have trained together long enough that individual and collective decision-making have become the same process. They established positions at the primary vectors and gave a signal small enough to be invisible to anyone not looking for it. Then the lead figure entered, medium height, the kind of build that does not announce itself, a face that moves through crowds without snagging on memory. Tactical gear worn with the ease of a second skin movements, carrying the unhurried precision of someone who has already confirmed the perimeter is clean and is now interested in the interior. He stopped in front of Sloan. Ghost Dragon status report. Area secure, casualties nil, witnesses intact. She kept her voice level. Perimeter operatives, 11 in custody, 1 extracted east before secondary containment closed, currently being tracked. Evidence collection, in process, communications intercepts, downloading. Source hardware at the signals building, identified and isolated 40 minutes ago. He moved away and began coordinating with his team, and the canteen became what it had apparently always been destined to become, the final scene of an operation 3 months in the making, visible as such only in retrospect, which is the only angle from which traps are ever fully visible. Slade Norris was brought in through the east door at 17 minutes past lights out. 2 operators flanked him with the professional neutrality of people transporting something significant. He was not restrained beyond the immediate authority of their presence. He had not attempted resistance at the perimeter, which told the operators something they filed without comment. He walked through the canteen with the look of a man taking inventory. Not of exits or threats, of something internal, the inventory of a man completing an equation he had been running for a very long time and is now arriving at the sum. He stopped in front of Sloan. The room was watching. He reached into his jacket slowly, hands visible, the motion telegraphed with the deliberateness of someone who understands exactly what that motion looks like in a room full of armed people, and produced nothing. He brought his hands together and spoke 5 words. Tango 77 Echo, Ghost Dragon. The operators on either side of him shifted their weight fractionally. The energy in the room changed in the way air pressure changes before weather, subtle, immediate, not quite nameable until after. Sloan looked at him for 3 seconds. Stand down, she said to the operators. They stepped back. Slade looked at Aldred directly. His voice had lost the flat operational affect he had used in the canteen earlier. What replaced it was the directness of a man who has been performing a version of himself for an extended period and has reached the moment when performance is no longer necessary or possible. I have not worked for Shadow Protocol, Colonel. I have worked inside Shadow Protocol. That distinction matters operationally and legally, and in every other sense that will become relevant in the coming months. Aldred was very still. They recruited me through standard methodology, identified a grievance, offered a solution, established dependence incrementally. The grievance was real. In 2014, the CIA burned me on an operation and left me without cover or support in a location where that had specific consequences. He paused. I am not asking for sympathy, I am providing context. He looked at Sloan. I have been feeding Shadow Protocol-controlled intelligence for 14 months. Information accurate enough to maintain their confidence and structured carefully enough to redirect their operational priorities away from assets that would have been compromised without intervention. Another pause. I was identified 6 months ago. By whom? Aldred asked. Slade did not look away from Sloan. Understanding moved through the canteen. The way it moves when a story believed to be understood is revealed to have had additional architecture the entire time, not reconstructing itself, but expanding the way a room looks different when you discover the doors you did not know were there. Sloan said, Slade Norris has been a cooperative asset of the Ghost Dragon program for 6 months. His role in this operation was to provide Shadow Protocol with the intelligence they needed to believe that Fort Davidson was a viable target for surveillance and recruitment. Every piece of information they received about this installation's security vulnerabilities through his channel was information we gave him to give them. Aldred said slowly, the 91 days were a construction, yes. 3 months of Shadow Protocol building an operation inside Fort Davidson. 3 months of believing they were watching a target who did not know she was being watched. 3 months of positioning operatives, establishing communication intercepts, identifying personnel for potential recruitment. All of it based on intelligence they believed reliable because it came from a source they believed they had compromised. All of it architecture. All of it designed to deliver Shadow Protocol to this evening. Aldred turned to Slade. What happens to you now? It was not a hostile question. The question of a man who understood the answer would have implications extending beyond this room, involving legal frameworks and classification levels and institutional decisions not his to make. That is being determined at a level above both of ours, Slade said. What I can tell you is that I will not be walking out of here as a free civilian. I accepted that when I made the choice to surface tonight. There are 14 months of operational activity that require formal review, regardless of intent. He looked at Sloan. I knew what surfacing would cost. I made the calculation that the cost was appropriate given the alternative. Sloan said, the review process will reflect the full record of your cooperation. That is not absolution, it is accuracy. He nodded once, not looking for absolution, not having expected it, having done the arithmetic on this moment a long time ago, and arrived at peace with the sum. Two Dragon balance operators moved to flank him, not aggressively, with the professional neutrality of an escort. Slade went with them without additional words through the east door into the pre-dawn dark of West Texas toward whatever formal reckoning awaited him in the institutional machinery that handles men who have operated in the space between allegiances. Aldred watched him go. He was quiet for a moment. Then Blythe Mercer, the photograph. The tablet chimed. Sloan read the message. The room did not know what was on the screen. What it saw was the change in her face, not dramatic, not the collapse of composure, but the arrival of something recognizably human in a way the operational precision of the previous hours had kept carefully managed. Something that could not be managed now, not entirely, and that she did not try to manage. She read it twice. Then she turned the tablet so Aldred could see. He read it. His expression completed a journey in approximately 4 seconds. The message was from a number tracing to no registered device. It contained 7 words in an image. The image showed Blythe Mercer, not bound, not unconscious, standing in what appeared to be a communications facility in Northern Europe, surrounded by people in tactical gear who were not her captors, standing with the particular expression of someone who has completed a very long and very demanding piece of work and is feeling in the immediate aftermath something close to relief. The 7 words, package delivered, network terminated, coming home, love you. The silence that followed was the best kind, not empty but full, carrying within it the completion of something that had been in motion for a long time, with the quality of a held breath finally released. Blythe Mercer had not been a hostage. She had been an operator executing a parallel mission, using Shadow Protocol's confidence in their leverage against her sister as the access credential for the deepest penetration of their European command structure the Ghost Dragon program had ever achieved. The photograph, the 72-hour ultimatum, the bound and unconscious, staging all of it built with the same architectural patience that had built the Fort Davidson operation, with the same understanding that the most effective trap is always the one the target helps construct. 3 years in the planning, 2 sisters, 2 continents, 1 evening. Aldred said quietly, how many other installations? 17 over the past 8 months. Fort Davidson was the final node. She paused. It was also the one that required the most time. The culture here created the most documentation and the most difficult operating environment. She looked at him when she said it. Not with accusation, with the directness of a professional delivering an accurate assessment to the person responsible for the assessment's subject. Aldred received it the way it was delivered. What happened next took the time that things which matter require. The perimeter was secured. The 11 Shadow Protocol operatives in custody were processed with the efficiency of a protocol written specifically for this purpose, with legal and intelligence considerations already built into the procedure. The 12th operative, tracked east from the secondary containment point, was located on a county road 12 miles from the installation and taken into custody without incident 40 minutes later. The communication intercepts from the signals building were copied to secure storage and the source hardware sealed for transport. Slade Norris's 14 months of controlled intelligence feeds were recovered and cataloged, each entry annotated with the misdirection designed to redirect rather than expose. When the main power was restored and the fluorescent lights returned to their standard hum, Warren Aldred stood in the center of the canteen and did the part of his job that he had worn a uniform long enough to understand was the most important part. The part that happens after the operation. The part that determines what the operation actually meant. Sergeant First Class Briggs Harmon. Briggs came to attention. The motion was correct and complete and had the quality of something that matters to the person performing it rather than to the audience watching. Your conduct tonight demonstrated a systematic pattern of behavior that this command will no longer accommodate. The formal record will reflect the full scope of this evening's events and the 3-year context in which they occurred. Aldred paused. Effective immediately, you are reduced in grade to private first class pending formal review proceedings. You will report to Fort Bragg within 72 hours for assignment to the Ethical Leadership Rehabilitation Program. Briggs received this without visible reaction beyond the slight movement of his jaw. This is not a dead-end posting. It is a posting that will determine whether there is a version of your military career that continues from this point. Whether that version exists depends entirely on the work you choose to do there. Aldred held his gaze. I am not telling you this because I believe it will be easy or because I believe you deserve leniency. I am telling you this because I have been in this uniform for 34 years, and I have learned that the most expensive thing this institution does is discard people who could have become something useful if someone had been willing to do the harder work of requiring change rather than simply enforcing consequences. Briggs said, "Yes, sir," 2 words in the voice of a man for whom they mean something different than they did this morning. Lieutenant Delia Voss. She straightened. You are reduced in grades to second lieutenant. You will complete a mandatory 6-month mentorship program focused on the responsibility of senior female officers to create professional environments that elevate rather than undermine. Aldred held her gaze. The particular cruelty of what you did tonight was not incidental to your conduct. It was structural. You understood exactly what you were doing and made the calculation that the cost would fall on someone else. That calculation was wrong. I expect every subsequent calculation to reflect a different understanding of where costs land. Delia said, I understand, sir. Do you? She took an audible breath. 3 hours ago, I would have said yes and meant nothing by it. She stopped. Now I mean it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has spent decades learning the difference between those two things and believes he is seeing the second. Fletcher Quaid received a formal reprimand and mandatory additional training. He received it with the uncomplicated relief of someone who has spent the last 2 hours recognizing how small the distance was between his conduct and Briggs Harmon's, and is grateful that the formal record draws that distance more generously than his own memory does. Private First Class Colt Ashby. Colt came to attention. Aldred looked at him. The specific look of a man seeing something particular. Under the authority granted to field commanders in exceptional operational circumstances, and with the concurrent recommendation of personnel holding clearance levels not appropriate to specify in this room, you are hereby promoted to the grade of sergeant by battlefield commission, effective immediately. He paused. This is not standard procedure. It is the correct procedure for what happened tonight. Colt said, Sir, I just did what my grandfather would have expected of me. I know, Aldred said. That is exactly the point. He held Colt's gaze a moment longer than the formal exchange required. Thank your grandfather for me, he said, when you write to him. Colt nodded, his hands for the first time since he had stood up in the canteen hours ago and said words that could have ended his career before it began, were entirely steady. In the hour that followed, as the operational components of the evening moved toward their formal conclusion, and the canteen returned slowly to something resembling its ordinary self without ever being able to fully become it again, Sloan found Aldred standing near the window at the far end of the room. He was looking at the parking lot, the ordinary flat dark of a West Texas night. Nothing theatrical about it, simply the absence of light rather than the presence of something. She stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when they have been through something together, and the something has not yet resolved into the shape it will eventually have in memory. He said, Frances Aldridge. She waited. Her name was Frances Aldridge. Corporal 1987, one of the best soldiers I served beside in my first 10 years. And there was a sergeant in her unit who ran the same architecture that Harmon ran tonight, and I knew and I filed it somewhere I am not proud of. He stopped. I approved her transfer request without a conversation. I never learned what became of her. He was not asking for absolution. The voice of a man who understood that what he was describing did not have absolution as its appropriate conclusion. He was saying it out loud because it needed to be said out loud on the other side of a night that had been precisely about this. Sloan said, I know what became of her. Aldred turned. She retired as a Chief Warrant Officer 4 in 2009. She lives outside Richmond. 3 children. She ran a private security consulting firm for 8 years after leaving the service. Sloan paused. She is also a person who spent 30 years in an institution that required her to work substantially harder for substantially less recognition, and she did it anyway because she believed in what the institution was supposed to be, even when the institution was not being it. Aldred was quiet for a long time. Do you think she is all right? I think she became exactly who she was going to become, regardless of the obstacles. I think the obstacles cost her things they should not have cost her. Sloan paused. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The second one does not cancel the first. The first one does not excuse the second. He nodded. The nod of a man accepting a verdict he had been carrying for 32 years and was finally able to set down, not because it had been lifted from him, but because he had finally looked at it directly enough to understand its actual shape. The Ghost Dragon protocols, he said after a moment. What do I need to know? You will receive comprehensive briefing materials within 24 hours. The immediate priority is cultural, not procedural. New reporting structures and revised security protocols are straightforward to implement. Cultural change requires sustained attention over years, and it requires leadership that understands the hardest threats to an institution are not the ones arriving from outside it. I understand. I believe you, she said. She meant it the way things are meant when the meaning has been earned by the events preceding the words. Outside the window, the West Texas dark was beginning to thin at its eastern edge. Not with light exactly, but with the first suggestion of light, the initial indication that night is not permanent. Not even the long ones. Sloan Mercer left Fort Davidson at 0340 hours. No ceremony, no formal departure. She walked out the east door, the same door she had entered through 9 hours earlier, with her oversized jacket and her downcast eyes, and her careful performance of a woman who did not know where she was, and she crossed the parking lot to a vehicle waiting without its lights on. Aldred stood at the window and watched her go. She did not look back. That was not coldness. That was the discipline of someone who has learned to leave cleanly, who understands that attachment to the previous position is an operational liability, and that the work ahead requires undivided attention. The vehicle pulled onto the highway heading west toward whatever came next in a chain of operations that had been running for 3 years and would continue running for as long as necessary. The Dragon Balance has 12 names attached to it. At 3:41 on a Saturday morning in West Texas, one of those 12 was moving toward the next thing she was supposed to do. The work does not stop. For people built the way she was built, the work continuing is its own form of peace. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at a house in Savannah, Georgia, addressed in the careful handwriting of a young man who was still learning the particular pressure to apply to a pen when what he is writing down matters. The letter was longer than usual. It covered things the previous letters had not covered in language, still finding its shape, the language of someone who has seen something and is working out what it means, which is how all genuine understanding is arrived at and the only way it sticks. Near the end, there was a paragraph that read, "Someone told me to thank you. I don't know exactly how to pass that along, but she said to tell you that what you taught me held. I think you'll understand what I mean by that. I think maybe you always knew this moment was possible. I think that might be why you told me what you told me all those times and all those letters across all those years." The man who received the letter had hands that no longer worked well enough to type. He sat at a table near a window in early morning light and read it twice slowly the way he read everything now. Then he folded it and set it beside the others. He sat with something that old soldiers sometimes sit with when they have lived long enough to see the things they planted begin to grow. He did not call it pride. He had never been comfortable with that word, which seemed to him to locate the credit in the wrong place. He called it evidence. Evidence that the things worth passing on do get passed on if the person doing the passing is patient enough and honest enough and willing to say the hard thing at the right moment to the right person while they are still young enough to be shaped by it. Evidence that the line holds. There is a generation of Americans who grew up in the long shadow of Korea and came of age in the Cold War's middle years when the great institutions of American life were demonstrating themselves to be more complicated than the version taught in schools. They watched the Watergate hearings on television. They watched institutions they had been raised to trust reveal that trust could be a form of vulnerability. They learned, some of them, the ones paying attention in the right way, the difference between what an institution claims to be and what it actually is when no one is performing for an audience. Most of them spent the rest of their lives trying to hold both of those things simultaneously. The belief in what the institution is supposed to be, the knowledge of what it sometimes is instead. That tension does not resolve. It is not supposed to resolve. It is supposed to produce something, a refusal of easy conclusions, a willingness to look at the gap between the ideal and the actual without pretending the gap is either smaller or larger than it is. The Dragon Balance is not a tattoo. That is what the people who know what it means understand about it, and what the people who saw it for the first time in a Fort Davidson canteen on a Friday night in 2019 began slowly to understand in the months that followed. It is a question asked of the person who carries it, asked every morning, asked in every room, asked in the moments when the answer is easy and in the moments when the answer costs something. Not are you strong enough, not are you skilled enough. Are you the same person in the light as you are in the dark? Are you the same person when the room is watching as you are when the room is not watching? Are you the same person when the room holds power over you as you are when you hold power over the room? 12 people in the world carry the mark on their skin. The question it asks is not limited to those 12 people. It never has been. In his chair by the window in Savannah, with the morning coming through the glass at the particular angle that particular light takes at that particular hour, the old man with the chosen hands sat with his grandson's letter and thought about a 19-year-old boy he had once been standing on frozen ground at the far end of the world, learning something about human beings that cannot be learned anywhere else and does not leave you after. He thought about what he had tried to pass on across all the years and all the letters. He thought about evidence. He looked out the window at the ordinary morning light. Evidence, he thought again, that it was worth holding. That it was always worth holding.